Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. The fire hose continues. I warned you we were going to be doing a lot of interview episodes, and tonight I am so excited to. This has been the episode in the making. This is like all of those Hollywood movies that you're like they say that they're going to make it, and then something happens, and then they say, and then something happens. This is why I don't talk about the names of our guests before we have it happen because I think this is like the fourth time that we've rescheduled with this particular guest. Fortunately, she's been on the show a bunch of times before, so she has very low expectations, as she should. Very excited to be talking because one of the things that has sort of fallen through the cracks, and we were just talking about this in the pre-interview. I'm going to do a preamble and then I'll do the introduction because I'm whimsical tonight. Um, One of the things we were talking about is because there are all of these fires that are going on in the province of Alberta right now, it's very, very easy to focus on the most recent one or the one that's burning the brightest at that particular moment, but it doesn't diminish the importance of the other fires. And we got to talk, among other things, about the curriculum that is, and I'm going to use the word being foisted on Alberta students right now. Very excited to welcome back to the show the incomparable Dr. Carla Peck. Dr. Peck, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back, and I'm glad we finally found a time to make it
I
work.
ah I apologize that I just got
No, between both of our schedules, it's all good.
um I'm gonna do the quick little bio piece here because I have it up in front of me and it's very impressive. And I think that anybody who is unfamiliar, I'll make you blush a little bit. I
You
think
can
anybody who's
shorten it. It's okay.
unfamiliar, now I'm going to read all the awards. Uh,
Oh
uh,
my.
for anybody who's unfamiliar, Dr. Peck is a professor of social studies education in the Department of Elementary Education at the University of Alberta. I'm not actually going to read all of the awards because it would take half the episode. She has so many awards. It's ridiculous. We have gone to Dr. Peck many times in the past to talk about curriculum development and education in particular. It started back when we saw the very bad curriculum come from the UCP government. They made mugs, they made t-shirts. I may have some of both. I'm pretty sure. There we go. Dr. Peck has hers. So we've been wanting to loop back on that conversation for a while because there's a new social studies curriculum.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's safe to say um, it's better, but and I'm throwing a really big caveat on the end there, um, still not great. So it's kind of like if you had gangrene on your foot and you cut your foot off. Hey, you don't have the gangrene anymore, but you also don't have a foot. Am I getting the spirit of the conversation that I think we're going to have tonight mostly right, Dr. Pack?
I think so. I think that yes, the what was released in March and then very quickly revised after only 2 or 3 weeks of the possibility to provide feedback and very minimal revisions made in April of this year is, a little better than what we saw in 2021. But a little better shouldn't be what we're aiming for curriculum. It should be a lot better. It should be visionary. It should be creative and innovative. So anyway, we can get into all of that, but why I think it's not those things. Um, and yeah, so a little better, but not what I would hope for.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're up to your neck in sand and then it goes to just above your shoulders, it's a little better, but still not great.
Yeah.
So for anybody, let's do a little bit, appropriately enough, of a history lesson. Let's do a little bit of a condensed version of how did we get to where we are now? Because I always try to not assume that all of the listeners are as nerdy as I am. Uh, and so we had a curriculum process that was started by the progressive conservatives. I think that's important to highlight.
Mhm.
now we're at a place where we have the curriculum that we're getting. Everything that happened in the intervening 12 years, go.
Okay, so yes, very important to say that curriculum development started under the PCs. And in fact, probably goes back at least as far as 2010, where we had the Inspiring Education um, progress or process that where people went around the province gathering information about what are Albertans' vision for education and for students in up to 2030 sort of thing. They're thinking ahead over the next 20 years, what it is that students should be able to learn, know, be able to do by the time they graduate high school. And so it's been a long process. And um, when the NDP came to power, they sort of picked up the baton and tried to continue that work, and they did continue that work. They were highly consultative. They had an agreement with the Alberta Teachers Association to ensure that teachers were involved and really upfront and centered in the work, curriculum development work. I, full disclosure, was part of that work. They had two different types of groups for every subject area. So in social studies, they had a group of curriculum writers. That group was about 40 to 50 people, primarily teachers, but also people who were experts in curriculum development at universities, people who were subject matter experts like historians, geographers, that sort of thing, also working at universities. They had Indigenous, they had Francophone representation in the curriculum writing group. And then the other group they had was, they called it the Teacher and Educator Focus Group. And I was on that group for social studies. And our job basically was to review the work of the curriculum writers and provide feedback to that other group to say, oh, yeah, this looks really good, or think about ways you could strengthen this, or think about how you might do this in a different way. And the group that I was on, very similar composition, teachers, folks at universities, Indigenous representation, Francophone representation. And again, there were about 40 or 50 people in that group. And then that was repeated for each of the different subject areas. Math, you had the two groups, science, you had the two groups, and so on. The process got to the point where in late 2018, early 2019, there were drafts that were ready to be piloted in schools, but then, of course, the election was called and that process stopped. And so the drafts that were developed or sort of finalized under the NDP, started earlier, finalized under the NDP, never actually were piloted in schools. And so now we're under the UCP government starting in 2019. And we might remember, your listeners might remember that Jason Kenney very famously campaigned on putting the quote NDP curriculum through the shredder. And that was one of his, popular taglines at events that he went to. And sure enough, that's what happened. They ripped up the agreement with the Alberta Teachers Association. The groups that had existed, like the one that I was on and the curriculum writers groups, we didn't even get a notification that the groups were disbanded. I think I had to write to somebody to say, so I've got a meeting in my calendar. Are we still meeting? And oh no, let me get back to you. And of course, we weren't meeting because the groups were disbanded. And then Adriana LaGrange, who was Minister of Education at the time, she hired one or two experts in quotation marks for each of the subject areas. Consultants, they called them consultants, but it emerged through various news media investigations and so on that these folks were heavily involved in writing the curriculum. And I said experts in quotation marks because not all of the people who were hired by Alberta Ed were actually experts in curriculum development. Some were absolutely experts in, in research in particular areas, but others had no experience in curriculum development for K to 12. And the person who was involved in social studies, Chris Champion, had never been a teacher either. And so, yeah, so there were lots of problems there. And in October, November 2020, a draft of the social studies curriculum was leaked to the media. And that kicked off the firestorm that continued through to 2021, where that draft curriculum that was eventually officially released in early 2021, the social studies curriculum document was absolutely panned by critics, by parents, by students, by teachers, by Indigenous groups across the province, by Francophone groups across the province, by LGBTQ2S plus communities, and other marginalized communities in Alberta. And eventually, in December of 2021, it was pulled. And they said they were going to start again. And so they started again. They brought in a new consultant, and they did not involve teachers. The only time they involved teachers was when the curriculum was fully drafted, and then teachers had a couple of days to provide feedback. And here we are now. It was released in late March 2024. There were 2 or 3 weeks to provide feedback. It was finalized in April 2024. So right away, there's not enough time to do any substantial revisions when you only give yourself a couple of weeks to do that. And then it's being piloted in, I would say, more than half of the school districts in Alberta are piloting some aspect of the curriculum. They're not all necessarily piloting all grades or even all topics, but they are piloting some of it. So I think I should stop there. I've been talking like a long time.
No, that was good. And it's important, I think, to and you're going to see what I'm doing here in a couple of minutes. I think it's important to know your history. Uh, Otherwise, you don't know where you are and how you got there. Um, so, I am notorious for saying on the show, context is king, and
Mhm.
having the appropriate context for this conversation, I think, is very important. So, all of that being said, here we are. We've got this new curriculum. What do you think?
So it's a kindergarten to grade 6 curriculum. It is still very much heavily focused on um, lending itself to memorization of information. There are, especially as you advance through the grades, long lists of, discrete facts for kids to know. Um, I call it a wall of information. You sort of run into it. And let's be clear, when you learn history, of course, you need to know facts. But with research that I have led, a national youth survey of more than 2,000 young people aged 10 to 18 from across the country, they all reported, and these results are generalizable to a larger population. They all reported that while they believe strongly that history is important, their experiences in school are not satisfying their curiosity about learning history because they're reporting that they're doing lots of traditional kinds of teaching and learning experiences, read the textbook, answer questions, that kind of thing, work on worksheets, this sort of thing, as opposed to a more active, engaged way of learning history where we are giving kids artifacts, we're giving them documents to work with, we're asking them big, important questions. And with young kids, I like to frame it in terms of mysteries and that they're detectives and they're trying to solve the problem of the past, whatever. topic we might be looking into. And we're actually getting kids to do history. Um, and if we have time, maybe we can come back around to that concept of doing history. But this curriculum is not set up for kids to do history. It is set up for kids to memorize a bunch of information, fill out worksheets, regurgitate it back on a test. And the March version that was released, and I'll say again, the April version is not dramatically different because there was just no time to actually do any substantial revisions. I analyzed all of the skills and procedures in the March version. And I looked at what verbs are being used at the beginning, discuss this, explain this, and so on, which is a typical way of kind of writing learning outcomes, although those aren't classified as learning outcomes per se, but they are de facto learning outcomes because it's what we want kids to do. 55.2% of all of the skills and procedures in the curriculum were at the very low levels of remember and understand of a typology of learning outcomes that categorizes them in the different kinds of sort of the kind of thinking that's required by the activities and so on that we would get kids to do. So more than half were at the lowest level of thinking, and only 10% were at the higher levels of evaluate and create, which requires students to really understand something in order to be able to evaluate the role of women in society today, or evaluate how the role of women has changed in society over time. Well, you have to know all kinds of things to be able to do that evaluation, but you can only do that if you've been given the opportunity in the curriculum to actually do it. And so just on that analysis alone, the curriculum really falls short.
Why do you think there is? I'm not a teacher. I have no classical education in the art of teaching. But to me, it would seem, especially when you're talking about younger kids, like if I was to think of my kids when they were K through 6 age, um, if I was to say to them, here's 15 things I need you to remember, I'd be very, very lucky if they got like one or two. Um, because if you just fire hose them, there's nothing. But if you tell them a story, then
Mm.
that's how one of the ways I believe that, and you going to your doing history piece, that's how people can remember things. Like this is why people go to movies. This is why people watch TV shows. People love stories. And
Mm.
so is do you have any idea why they're taking that joy of the story out and just saying, or you could just memorize these things?
Well, part of it, I think, goes back to the very sort of philosophical underpinnings of this entire curriculum, not only social studies, but all of the different subject areas, which is the idea that there is one body of knowledge that is best, and one body of knowledge that it's the student's job just to absorb it, to learn it. And so it places students in a very passive role where their job is just to listen to the teacher and read the textbook and absorb as much as they can. And it also places one body of knowledge as superior than all other bodies of knowledge. It also vastly underestimates what it is that young kids can do. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I mean by doing history. Think about science classes. When you're in science class, especially as you move up through the grades, but actually it happens in elementary school too, where they're learning about different types of machines and pulleys and levers and all those sorts of things, and they actually build things. right? They see how far their little machine will travel or how far their boat will float, the watercraft that they've built, or they they plant a bean seed in a mug and they watch and see how it grows. And they come in, the little kids, they run in every day. How much did it grow today? And did it finally sprout? And they track it. And at the young grades, their teacher helps them track it. And, they measure, they notice its different properties. It grew a leaf, it grew this, it grew that. And then as you get up through the grades, you're now in a science lab. And I remember, lots of people might remember, this is a very common activity in science. You had to bring an onion to school and you peel the little flimsy part of the in between the layers of the onion, you put it under a slide, and now you're looking at what cells look like, and you're drawing cells, and you're noticing the properties of a cell. That's doing science. And there's no argument really that in order to learn science, you have to do science. In history, we think that for some reason, the traditional way of teaching history has been, okay, read this information or listen to this lecture and regurgitate it back to me somehow, whether it's in an essay or on a test or answering questions. That belies the actual nature of history. History is getting our hands dirty with artifacts, with documents, with oral histories, talking to people or listening to recordings of oral histories that have been recorded before our time, and actually figuring out, okay, with all of this stuff that I've collected about topic X, how can I use it to understand topic X? And you have to learn to evaluate artifacts, to read them. Read this mug. How would somebody 50 years from now understand what's written on this mug? And and what other contextual information would they need? You talk about the importance of context, corroboration. So I've got one newspaper article that tells me this, one newspaper article that tells me that. How do I understand what's happened 50 years from now or in the past? Well, I need to corroborate. I need to find other sources. I need to gather more evidence. That's what doing history is all about. And that's the kind of work that the students in our survey, again, over 2,000 youth responded, that's the kind of learning that they say gives them passion for studying the past. And not only that, deepens their understanding of the past. Because if I asked kids to say, here are 15 things you need to know about Confederation, the first thing they're going to say is, why? Why do I need to know this? But instead, history is a field that's full of questions, that's full of problems, that's full of debate. And by giving students long lists of information and just packages of material, okay, remember this and write it, see this over here, write it down over here, we are denying them the vibrancy of the field of history and the ability to actually develop skills that are very transferable today when we are flooded with disinformation. We are flooded with misinformation. We need citizens of every age to be able to say, this newspaper article says this newspaper article says that. What do I do with these competing accounts? The skills that we learn by doing history can help us today with that kind of critical literacy.
I know one of the criticisms that was leveled towards some of the subject matter, that is, to the best of my knowledge, I'll say, but I'm going to open the door for you to uh, do some clarification, um, is that there are some pieces of history we just don't want to talk about them anymore. And I really struggle with that. And I struggle with it for a couple of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons why I struggle with it, and I'm going to ask you about the whether how much history is in the new curriculum when it comes to topics like residential schools or the treatment of First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis folks over the
Mm,
history of Canada. But one of the reasons why I struggle with excluding that is that it denies kids the ability to understand how much progress has been made.
mm,
Um, I don't think that the the emphasis on the syllable needs to be, oh, these horrible, horrible, horrible things happened. I mean, and I'm not saying in any way to suggest that denying the horrible things is not something I'm suggesting by any stretch of the imagination. But in order to understand how much we've learned and how much we have been able to at times access information that tells us what we need to do in order to do some truth, do some reconciliation.
mm,
Those are to me things that, despite the inherent tragedy, should to some degree be celebrated because we moved forward. And if we deny kids the opportunity to go and have that understanding, I'm not saying they need to have like all of the details at kindergarten. I'm not
mm,
suggesting that. Um, but for them to have an understanding of this is where we started, this is where we are, this is where hopefully most of us aspire to be. I don't know how you tell that story in a meaningful way without having the TRC pieces and the honesty about Canada's history. So even though I already know the answer, I'm going to ask the question anyways. How much is included about Canada's difficult history, including the residential schools in the current draft that's being taught to kids?
There's nothing about residential schools in the K to 6 curriculum. And that is despite the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action that called us, educators, to include the teaching of residential schools. I want to take a moment to recognize and honor Justice Murray Sinclair, who passed away today on the day that we're recording this. And he was an incredible leader. He was the commissioner of the Royal of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, he was a justice. I mean, he had so many roles: father and grandfather and friend, and a real leader in our country. And will be his leadership and his vision and his heart will be dearly missed because and I never met him. I wish I had. I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet him. Um, he's well known for saying education got us into this. Education is what it'll take to get us out of this. A bit of a paraphrase there, but and by excluding residential schools, the teaching about the history of residential schools in the K to 6 curriculum, we're doing our students and our society a huge injustice and disservice. Um, I agree with you. You're not going to include all of the horrors of resident at kindergarten or grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3 even. Um, but young kids can understand what it means to miss your family.
Hmm.
Yeah, we have so many students who speak English as an additional language. So those students can understand what it means to not be able to speak your language in school. Not that they're not prevented now, but they're now having to learn a new language. Um, and so there are ways that you can teach about this at the elementary level that is done in a careful way, carefully, but also full of care. And, you know, the fact that our government has chosen not to include it, um, I think it's cowardly. And I think it is insulting, especially to Indigenous peoples who for so long, those histories have not been included in curriculum. And here we have an opportunity with a new curriculum to be able to write a curriculum in a good way. Again, Indigenous communities were not consulted in the writing of this curriculum. If they were consulted, it was after the fact, after it was already drafted. And so I just think it is such a missed opportunity. And going back to your earlier point, sort of as you were introducing this topic, we can't understand our society today without a full understanding of how we got to where we are and what are the issues that we're still facing as a society. Yes, what are the things that have gotten better, but how much more work do we still need to do? And by taking a sort of a doing history approach where we get kids to actually learn some of the tools of the historian and investigate and take deep dives into learning about the past, they can understand that progress is rarely easy. It is rarely, maybe never even and progresses along and never has a setback. If we are and this is what this curriculum does. It presents the history of white Western civilization as progress oriented, as if things went smoothly, as if that was the only way that things could have happened, and it was the only right way for our history to develop. And we've accomplished a lot in our society. We still have a long way to go, and we can't understand the what's currently facing our society today unless we dig into those darker parts of our past.
And I think that there's also, um, you know, the notion that progress is this linear is just, and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes, but um, I think that there's also a disservice that's being done to kids when it comes to not presenting the fact that progress doesn't just happen. It is
Right.
it is something that has to be like every inch, every centimeter, every millimeter. See how I jumped a metric there? It is not something that happens by accident. It is something that is uh, fought for disproportionately by the people who are the ones who need that progress the most. Um, and to not present that to kids, and I'm going to use this as a pivot here, does not do, I think, as good of a job as we could in presenting them for the bumps in the road of progress, the flexes in the moral arc,
Mhm.
where it feels like there are some things that there's a maxim that I love: the what is understood need not be discussed. And the problem with that is that what is understood is such a tiny, fragile pool of things. And so to present the way that society moves to kids as being um, uh, inevitable
Mhm.
is a disservice, because as we're seeing unfold in the province right now, we can have things that I have to be so careful with my wording here, that I think by a reasonable estimate, most people, given all of the information, would go, wait, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? Uh,
Mhm.
it's harmful. Why are we doing this? Uh, but it's happening nonetheless. And of course, I'm talking about the new legislation that we saw introduced last week in the legislature, punching down on um, I mean, in particular, it's punching down on trans youth, but it's punching down on the entire LGBTQ2S plus community. I would also make the argument and have that it's punching down on parental rights, ironically. Uh,
Mhm.
and one of the things that I worry about is, I find myself going as we're having these conversations about these new policies, I find myself going, and I'm going to use some language here. Are you fucking kidding me? We have to have this conversation. Like,
Mhm.
are you kidding me? We have to have this conversation. Uh,
Mhm.
but we do. And I am, as I have said many times on the floor, I am the evolutionary apex of privilege, because I'm a middle-aged white guy with tattoos that people try to avoid most of the time. So I don't have very many problems. And if I'm the one going, wait, what? We have to have this conversation?
Mhm.
I can only imagine what kids who have not had the benefit of an unhealthy preoccupation with history, uh, how they're approaching it. And this is another area that I want to get your thoughts on because there are some elements that I don't
Mhm.
know that have been particularly well fleshed out in the conversation, unsurprisingly. Uh,
Mhm.
so, if it's okay with you, is there anything else you want to add to the curriculum piece before we move to the very frustrating piece?
Well, I'll just say that I agree with you about the importance of helping children understand not only how things happen, but who made things happen in the past. One of my favorite concepts in history is the concept of historical agency, because that's about how who made things happen in the past, why, what are the circumstances that paved the way for them to be able to make change, or what barriers did they encounter, or a little bit of both. Did they have both barriers and sort of affordances that allowed them to make change? Did they work alone? Did they work in groups? What were the contexts in which they were able to affect change? Because not only does that help us understand what happened in the past, but they can also then be models for students today to say, oh, that's how they made change happen. They saw a law that they didn't think so. Women didn't have the right to vote, and women mobilized to try and earn the right to vote, not without pushback, not without ridicule, not without all kinds of barriers. And seeing that model can be, oh, now we've got anti-trans legislation. How can we actually mobilize? What do we need to do? What skills do we need? Who can we get to support us? That kind of thing. So I think those historical examples, they have a direct connection, in my view, to citizenship today and civic action today.
Yeah. One of the things that I have quietly wondered about is whether or not the removal of some of those things is whether it's subconscious or whether it's conscious, uh, an attempt to disarm to some degree.
Mm.
But I ruminate on many things. Um, the two bills in particular that I wanted to get your take on because I think they fall uh, into the Venn diagram of your areas of expertise. The first one is Bill 27, which is the Education Amendment Act. This is the one that sees the forced notification for any kid who wants to use different pronouns or have a variation of their names, um, as well as it has some pretty massive changes in regards to how anything to do with human health is
Mhm.
is taught. Um, so I'm curious what your thoughts are for the notification piece, because to me, my understanding of what schools aspire and should aspire to be is safe spaces where the kids can go and do their very best at learning the things free of distractions. And this seems to me to be the introduction of a profoundly unnecessarily and a profoundly harmful uh distraction for the kids from learning. But that's my thoughts. What are yours?
I think the idea of forced notification is inherently dangerous. That there are young people who, for a variety of reasons, are not feeling safe to live the life they want to live their true identity in the home. And school might be the only place that they can actually kind of let their shoulders down and breathe out for a few hours a day where they're able to live their true self, their true identity. Not to say that there aren't still challenges with, because not everybody in a school, kids and other, maybe won't be as accepting as we might hope them to be, but they might have one teacher who is their safe person in the school who they know they can go to, and they might not have that at home. And so the idea that teachers would be required to notify parents uh, for a name, using a different name or using a different gender identity, um, I think inherently will put some young people in danger of being harmed, of being kicked out of the house. We all know these stories. These stories are not new stories. We know that the majority of kids who are homeless are kids who identify LGBTQ2S+. We know that the majority of kids who experience harm are members of that community, and bullying and so on. And so I just think it's cruel, and I think it's dangerous.
One of the things that I constantly struggle with, and it seems to me to be such a self-evident truth that I can't wrap my head around how people can't wrap their heads around it, is as I watch my language with the teacher in front of me. I've already dropped an F-bomb, so I'm
That's all right.
lines after this. But to me, the self-evident truth in this whole conversation is if a parent has been successful in building a relationship with their kids where those kids feel safe, this is a non-issue. If the kids do not feel safe having these conversations with the parent, that is a failure of only the parent, period. And if the parent lacks the ability to recognize that, that is in and of itself in some ways disqualifying as to what demands they get to make of any other system in regards of how they're going to assert control. Because if your kid trusts you, if your kids feel safe with you, then they're going to tell you. And if they need to talk to a trusted person first, that's okay too. But the only place where any of these arguments start to make any sense for me is if you start with the presupposition that there's something wrong. And if I know about it, then I can exert some sort of parental control that is going to um, change who my kid is. And that again to me should be somewhat disqualifying in regards to how much will you get to exert on a kid. Um, but I'm also curious, like I can't imagine that this creates a safe space, a safe learning environment for kids. Because if you're that kid who is wrestling with these issues, you now have to just eat it. You have to just eat it until you're 18. And if you are that kid, um, who knows if dad finds out, he's going to beat the shit out of you. And it happens. And I mean, it just does. It's a horrible truth. And, you can have the pundits who step up and say, "Oh, I believe that all parents love their kids and nobody would ever do anything to hurt your kids." And I'd love to be able to see the world through those rose-colored glasses, but that's not the real world. Um, and it saddens me to no end that there are kids who are going to not be able to commit to the experience of learning because of all of this stuff. And this to me seems to be the kind of thing that should be included in the curriculum because it is such a big conversation. And the kids are going to wrestle with it no matter what. Like the dumb thing, and this is where I'm going to pivot to the sex ed piece. The dumb thing to me about the whole sex ed thing is, oh, I see. So by getting the teachers to not talk about the sex stuff, all of the students will stop talking about the sex stuff too.
Never mind talking about it. They'll stop having sex
Exactly.
as it, if you don't talk about it.
Yeah, like let's just bury our heads in the sand and then we'll be able to feel less uncomfortable until Timmy brings home his new son at 16. Like it's just tell me about your thoughts on the sex ed stuff.
Well, I want to go back a minute. Um, Families are complicated and there are so many different factors. I agree with you. If a child feels safe in their family relationship, then hopefully they'll feel safe talking about these things. But we know that's not always true, even in very loving families. It's just awkward. It's scary to talk about. And so you just may not want to talk about it. Or they might not be the first people you want to talk to. You might want to talk to somebody else first and get advice about how do I talk to my parents about this or and so and then there are so many different factors that shape a worldview in terms of what is right, what is wrong, and kids are trying to navigate different belief systems, different worldviews. Maybe the parent's worldview doesn't match the child's worldview anymore, and or vice versa. And so it's really, really complicated and hard. And I don't want to kind of ignore that piece, right? How hard this is. And again, even in the most loving family, a kid just might not want to talk about this with their parents because it's like, oh, it's embarrassing or it's scary or whatever. Um, and so, I teach a graduate level course called Teaching for Social Justice, and we explore different forms of oppression in society. Racism, sexism. We also explore oppression related to gender identity and sexuality. And sometimes uh, it's the first opportunity that my students have had to actually learn about this because their education didn't include it. And so I think about that for parents too, that maybe their education didn't include these kinds of conversations. And so they don't know what the heck to talk about. And now, are there resources? Yes. Can we be better at helping parents understand where to go to get information? Are there ways that we can support? But, so I don't want to cast, all parents in the same light well, if your kid can't talk about it, then, maybe it's something you're doing wrong, but maybe they just don't have the skills. Maybe
Yeah.
they don't have the background. And maybe even if all of those pieces are in place, they still don't have that conversation because it's just kind of icky, right? The student doesn't, or the young person doesn't just want to bring it up because they don't know how, kind of thing. Now, that I need to acknowledge, of course, that there are those circumstances where parents don't respond well to this information. And we know the stories of kids, as I mentioned before, being kicked out of the home, being, um, you know, abused or what, and those are horrifying, horrifying situations. Um, but to come back to this legislation in terms of how it's going to affect kids in the school, in addition to what we've already talked about, you can't learn if you're terrified. You can't learn if you're terrified. Is my teacher going to rat me out to my parents? Are one of the other students going to say something? When mom comes to pick me up after school, after the basketball game or whatever, or is somebody going to say something in the stands at the soccer game? Or, you can't learn if you're terrified. And this legislation puts a chill in the entire school system. It's going to make kids afraid. It's going to make teachers afraid. I'm also thinking about teachers who are members of these communities, LGBTQ2S+, and especially trans communities, which is a real target of this legislation. What does this mean for the teachers who identify in those ways? I just think it's cruel and it's unnecessary and it's dangerous and it's solving a problem, creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify my position as well. Um, I believe that for the parents that legitimately do want the best for their kids, not what they like when my kids are sick, I take them to a physician. When my kids want to learn how to do computer coding, I take them to somebody who knows how to do computer coding. Recognizing that there are limitations in the depth and breadth of my knowledge does not make me a bad parent. I would argue recognizing those things makes you a good parent. And so I don't think that like even if the conversations are uncomfortable or even if the kid is not at a place where they want to have that conversation with that parent at that moment in time, I believe that the parents who want the best for their kids are going to say, wherever my kid needs to go to get good information and get support, do it. Make it
Mhm.
happen. The parents that scare me are the ones who say, I want to know. I want
Mhm.
them. I have to know one way or the other because I'm going to fix this. Those are the ones that scare the crap out of me, and I imagine those are the ones that scare the crap out of the kids too. Uh,
Mhm.
I want to talk about the sex ed stuff as well because I'm curious how on a curriculum level, on a curriculum design level,
Mhm.
how do you manage the restrictions that have been put in place without simply saying there's a bunch of stuff that we're just not going to talk about? Because, all it takes is, I hadn't even thought of the fact that there could be a trans teacher, which for the record is fine. But there's so many different questions. There's so many, like, I don't know how you watch a movie like Mrs. Doubtfire and not come up with some questions about like, oh, what's going on there? What's happening? A teacher could not discuss a movie like Mrs. Doubtfire, even though that's drag. It's not trans, two different things. But a teacher couldn't discuss that because in the risk that there's some parent out there who's going to go, oh, they're talking about that trans stuff. It's not trans, it's drag, different. Um, they wouldn't be allowed to talk about it. So if a kid comes and says, hey, I watched this really funny movie, Robin Williams, Mrs. Doubtfire, the teacher then has to do some sort of acrobatic mental calculus to say, wait, that could in some way be construed as something that I haven't been given authority to talk about by the ministry, which is a chilling sentence in and of itself, by the way.
Mhm.
Um, I can't, we can't talk about Mrs. Doubtfire today. We can't talk about any of those things.
Well, I mean, just from a logistical perspective, requiring opt-in for any kind of topics that relate to sexuality, sexual education is a logistical nightmare. Any parent knows the experience of, picking up their kid's backpack and finding a bunch of forms crumbled in the bottom of them, right? because they were supposed to be signed and returned a week ago or whatever. I know a lot of that's done electronically now through Power School and these other sorts of things, but not every province or not every part of the province has that capacity, right? Not everybody's got internet access. Seems hard to imagine, those of us who live in cities, but there are people, including in cities, who can't afford internet, but also, in other parts of the province where the connectivity isn't good. So they might actually be passing out, paper things to be signed. So just from a logistical perspective, it's a bit of a nightmare, to say the least. But from a curriculum perspective, in the grade 5 curriculum, in the new social studies curriculum, students are supposed to learn about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, grade 5 or grade 6, and perhaps both. And I don't know how you talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms without talking about the history for the struggle for rights, including for the LGBTQ, trans, communities. And so, planning for that. And then, you have to provide so much notification, 30 days, I think it is, to parents and caregivers. And then a parent can then opt their child out. Well, what are we saying there? We're saying that the curriculum that the Minister of Education and the province of Alberta has deemed to be important for students to learn, we're now going to say anyone can opt their kid out of any part of it. And so then is none of it important if you can opt your kid out because you just don't like the topic? That doesn't make any good curriculum educational sense to me, or just doesn't even make common sense. Um, I will also note that there is nothing in the curriculum that is actually specifically related to LGBTQ2S+. That is the acronym or versions of that acronym, or even, the word gay or trans or whatever. It does not exist in the current draft of the social studies curriculum, which means that's an entire community that's been left out of the curriculum, but also it robs students of the opportunity to understand the struggle for rights, that community has faced, that our society has faced, to try and bring people into the fold of who is protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so, again, I think we're doing a real disservice in the same way that we're not talking about and teaching about residential schools. We're not talking about contemporary issues that matter to us in society and enabling our students to actually have informed conversations about these things.
Well, it's worse than that because it's not just that it's opt out, it's opt in. So if I want my kid to be able to partake in a human sexuality course, I have to opt in. I have to say yes, please. But the other wild part of the legislation to me is that you can opt in part. And so there's a part of me that goes, okay, so we've been hearing for years, more than 18 months, by the way, Danny. But we've been hearing for years about how teachers are overwhelmed. They're wildly under-resourced. They're overburdened with administrative stuff. Let's now make this like uh MCU style bifurcation of the timeline where there's going to be one segment of the class that's going to do the sex ed. There's going to be another segment of the class. They can only do these parts of the sex ed. And then there's going to be the segment of the class that is going to, I don't know, spin around in circles until they see God. So that is to me like, depending on the parts of the program that is opted into, um, that seems to me to be creating
Oh, it's a nightmare. It's a
like
nightmare. And thanks, yeah, thanks for the clarification, but I had written down opt in and said opt out. It is a nightmare. Because let's say I'm teaching grade 5 and now I have to spend part of the day teaching a small group of kids about some topics. What do I do with the 20 other kids in the class in the meantime? I can't just say go to the gym and play around like that. That's not responsible. And so, they're going to hear whatever I'm teaching to the small group. And so, how do you even manage that? I mean, our principals now are going to have to create separate classes. Okay, these group, pull these groups, you go to the library and you guys do this. I mean, it's just a logistical nightmare. I would also say it again does a huge disservice. And I am not a sexual health education expert, but I know the stats, right? STI, the rates of STIs in Alberta are through the roof. Teen pregnancies going up. And so if we do not equip students with the knowledge and the skills to be able to have conversations with somebody who might want to have a relationship with them, then I can't imagine how things aren't going to get worse on those two fronts
It,
because we're, and oh my God, I mean, the amount of horrible information that is out there, including porn sites where kids go. We know kids go. Is that what we want kids to learn about what relationships are like? I certainly don't.
Under these rules, and this is sort of the example that I've been saving for a rainy day, because I think it highlights just how regressive this is. Under these rules, Degrassi High couldn't be shown. Like an entire season of Degrassi High couldn't be shown in high school classrooms because Spike gets pregnant.
Mm,
Um, and you couldn't like the most benign Canadian content that's out
mm.
there. You couldn't show that in a high school classroom. I mean, I can't imagine that there would be that many high school kids these days who are like, yeah, show me the show from the 80s. I'd love to watch that. But there's so many programs that would be out of reach because of of this new legislation. It boggles my mind.
Well,
Um,
and also really high quality programs and organizations that develop high quality materials that are very well versed in having conversations with kids of different ages about what do we call the different body parts that we have? What is what should you know about who is allowed to touch you? Like these are all conversations that unfortunately we have to have with young people because we know young people of horribly very young ages all the way up through do suffer abuse. And sometimes if they not learning about this in the home, but they are being subjected to abuse in the home, sometimes school is the only place where they're going to say, oh my God, that thing that happened, that's not supposed to happen.
well, I
And
mean, look
maybe
at
I should tell somebody. Sorry?
I just look at hockey culture. Like the problems that have existed in hockey culture. These are not things that have formed in a vacuum. And to me, that has been like, I don't understand why nobody's bringing that up. Because if you're going to say engaged parents would never ever teach their kids anything bad, and they'd make sure that they learn all the appropriate uh, uh, ways to interact with other people, there's a whole lot of abuse and assaults that beg to differ with that logic because when you've got like 17 and 18-year-olds who are on various different sports teams assaulting other people, like where are you going to put that? And
Hmm.
if you don't have the, I mean, that exists, it's undeniable. And so
Hmm.
if you don't have a mechanism, you don't provide the opportunity for those kids to learn, hey, you know what, consent actually really does matter. Um, then they continue to exist in that culture that's like, no, consent doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want because you're a big sports star or presidential candidate. That's a thing that exists. And if we don't take the opportunity that education provides to say, let's all get on the same page here, because we actually have laws about this stuff. Like we have laws that say consent matters. And so it
Hmm.
should not be a leap to say, if we're going to say consent matters and that it's a crime to force yourself on another person without their consent, there's no moral ambiguity here. It's the criminal code. And so to say we're not going to teach things that are directly relevant to the criminal code here because
Unless you opt in.
unless you opt in, that to me is a failure of not only the responsibility that any society has, but it's fundamentally a failure of social contract.
Mhm.
Um,
It also just fundamentally denies the reality of kids' lives.
yeah.
They are talking about this stuff. They are looking up this stuff online. They're watching highly sexualized influencers on TikTok and other places. So to think that, going back to what we said earlier, to think that if you just don't talk about it, or if you talk about it in such a confined way and only to, the 10 students who opted in, and the other 20, as if they're not, do you think those 20 kids aren't going to be asking those 10 kids, hey, what'd you guys talk about? Of course they are. Of course they are. And so to think that these conversations aren't already happening with young people, including at the elementary age, is naive at best and irresponsible at work. I mean, this is potentially putting kids in danger because they aren't learning about things that can help them learn what healthy relationships look like and feel like and sound like, how to take care of themselves, how to protect themselves from violence or infection or pregnancy or whatever. And so, yeah, I just think well, I think actually the whole introduction of this suite of policies and legislation is craven politics at its worst because it was about pandering to a very select group of people in the UCP who were voting on a leadership.
Well, and I think we saw proof of that today. For the record, we're recording this on November 4th, but I think we saw proof of that today because we saw a boatload of policies come through today, in particular the halal mortgages with Alberta Treasury branches. Um, Weird how that came up the day after the AGM and not the day before. What a wild turn of events. I'm sure it's not for any reason other than um, scheduling's just a bitch show. Uh, it's laughable that this government can claim that they're not playing that kind of craven politics. Um, I want to talk about we're still not done. Uh, I want to talk about the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act because this is another area that I think that there are some unintended consequences which seem to be this government's specialty. Um,
Mhm.
because I'm thinking of the kid who goes to, you know, we're talking about the bravest of the brave at this point. Here's a kid who's won the lottery. They have supportive parents who have said, you know what, absolutely, you have our full support, even though the government won't let you access any of the medical treatments that any responsible medical professional would provide for you. We're still all in on you, kiddo. So you can be, with our full support, you can be who you are.
Mhm.
And so you have a trans kid who's attending high school and they are going to gym class. And here's the scenario that I don't have an answer for. Gym teacher says, hey, everybody, we're going to be doing track and field tryouts this week. we're going to practice all of the things in class today, and everybody should come out except for you, Timmy. Sorry. Daniel Smith says you can't try out for the track and field team, or Daniel Smith says you can't try out for the soccer team or the football team or the I don't care what team. That to me paints the ugliest of targets on that kid from so many different directions. Um, how do you how does one build a sports curriculum, a phys ed curriculum that firewalls somehow kids from harm from the fact that they're not going to be allowed to participate in those school sports? Because Danielle Smith can say as much as she wants, oh, they could create a separate league if they want. But if we're talking about rural Alberta, if we're talking about separate school systems, the notion, here's I'm just going to say it. The notion that the Catholic School Board in Calgary is going to put together a trans league is on its face laughable. The notion that any religious school is going to allow there to be the existence of a trans league is on its face laughable. So the message to these kids seems to be you just don't get to do any of the sports, which is incredibly dissonant for me, given that we had members of the UCP stand up in the legislature and talk about how important sports is, and team sports in particular, when it comes to building community and building leadership skills. So how do you build that curriculum, Dr. Pack?
We used to have segregated schools, and we decided that wasn't a good thing, segregated based on race. And so now we're saying we're going to segregate kids based on gender and identity when it comes to sports teams and things like that. Again, I'm not an expert in sports or physical education, but I do have expertise in questions of inclusion, social inclusion. And so, number one, the whole premise of this assumes you're going to know someone's trans. So, how are you going to know? Are you going to require them to drop their trousers so you can inspect them, or some other mechanism of showing them? That's repulsive on its face. So the assumption that you're just going to know that somebody is trans and then on that basis excludes them is ridiculous. But also just the premise that uh, you would exclude people from an opportunity to participate in sports in school or in other places um, is it's a form of segregation, and it's a form of discrimination. And it is also repulsive on those grounds. And it's denying kids an opportunity to socialize, to learn the different social skills that you learn when you participate in a team sport, and to learn skills you might discover you really love a particular sport. But how are you going to do that if you don't ever have an opportunity to play? You might discover you're really talented in a sport, but how are you going to do that if you don't have the opportunity to play? And so I think that in terms of how this could affect youth, it's another way, in addition to all these other uh, legislation that's being imposed on us. It's another way to exclude an already vulnerable population. And that's disgusting to me and really reprehensible.
I also got to say, and I know I've said this before, but I find it wild that this notion of um, there's this massive advantage that's afforded to men in the vast majority of these sports. Uh, I just don't buy it. And the reason why I don't buy it is because years ago I used to do combat sports. And I am 100% certain, because it happened, that there are women out there who could absolutely mop the floor with my ass. And even like right now, I'm at 190 pounds. I know how to handle myself fairly well, but I got no illusions that there's plenty of women out there who could completely demolish me. Um, And so it seems to me to be such a lazy argument, especially when we start to talk about I mean, I suppose if you take away the puberty blockers and you take away the hormone replacement therapy and you just say apples are apples, oranges are oranges until you turn 18, then maybe your argument might have some validity. But the all of the evidence is that after a year of the hormone things, everything is a wash anyways, if not a slight disadvantage. So it's a very strange argument to be made, I think.
And it's also a way to categorize bodies, right? So it's someone will look at a woman who presents as a woman and who might be more muscular than some other women on the team, and automatically the assumption is they must be trans.
Yeah.
Or somebody who presents as male maybe isn't as muscular, automatically they must be trans because they seem to have other kinds of characteristics that people don't categorize as male. And so it's built on all of these assumptions, erroneous assumptions. The whole premise is built on excluding people and discriminating from people and categorizing people. And it's just repulsive. And again, it's creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, the government even said they can't define how many trans people are even
Right,
participating in sports.
right. And
So,
how would they know? How would they know unless somebody said, "Hi, I'm trans"?
right. Um, this is a wild ride. We got some intensity going on here tonight.
We do.
Um,
There's only water in my cup, I'll just tell you. It's just
There,
water.
I just have it's a lemon lime flavoring concoction that I have going on. Um, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I know we're coming up to the 2 hour mark. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in regards to the curriculum, in regards to these policies and how they're going to affect the learning environments of kids? The floor is yours.
Maybe I'll just end with a story of when I was a brand new teacher. Sometimes, as I said earlier, a kid might have just one trusted adult in their life. And research has shown that that one person can make all the difference in that young person's life. And I was a brand new teacher, and I had developed a rapport, with my students. And one day, a young person came up to me and said, Mademoiselle Peck, as I was called at the time, they're calling me something I'm not. And I said, what do you mean? Who? And they said, people in the school ground and in the class. And I get chills thinking about this because here was a young person who was feeling very vulnerable, but thankfully felt safe enough to come and talk to me. And my message to that young person was that only they knew deep down inside who they are. And I didn't dismiss what was being said. I said, I know that hurts, but don't let them define who you are. You know who you are. And it was such a pivotal moment for me as an educator because in that moment where, again, I was a brand new teacher, there were lots of different ways I could have reacted. I could have said, okay, go see the guidance counselor, which would have kind of pathologized the problem and actually made it into like, oh, this is a problem that needs to be solved, rather than responding to the human that was in front of me. This is the role that teachers are in every day, where for some kids, they are going to be their trusted adult. And who knows, it could be I don't have enough food at home. It could be I'm questioning my identity. It could be I don't feel safe at home. Or it could be I feel like I'm not learning very much. It could be a million different things. But students need to know that school is a safe place and that there is at least one person in the school that they can go to if they need to talk to somebody. And that doesn't mean that parents get shut out of those conversations, but it might be this is the place where the student goes first for some kids. Not every kid, certainly not every kid, but for some kids, it might be the lifeline for them. And to create an environment where kids' identities are under scrutiny, where kids are told you can't be who you are, you can't be the person that's inside of you in this space because our government has made it unsafe for you, is unconscionable. And um, I think that years from now, we're going to look back on this. Lots of us are already saying and raising the alarm about this legislation. But years from now, we're going to look back and say, what on earth were we doing?
The only silver lining that I take out of all of this is going back to what you were saying about the history. Um, History has taught us that as much as oppression visits terrible, terrible harms on people, boy, it makes for a strong resistance. It does.
Mhm.
And the, I was at the protest in Calgary on the weekend. And I love the way that the community that's being targeted is able to convert the part of the rage and part of the anger and part of the hurt into just being fabulous. Like they did uh um a cover song and the whole crowd was singing and the chorus to the cover song was "Don't mess with queer folk."
Mhm.
And as I was watching that whole community uh and people who are being supportive of that community come together in that moment, there was a part of me that went, "Oh my God, you, they have no idea." They being the UCP and the people supporting these draconian policies, they have no idea what they've touched off because, like, my background's all punk. We just do anger. But these people
Mhm.
are doing anger and happy at the same time. They got this whole other arsenal to pull from. You're so screwed in the long run. And it's sad that it has to be a long run, but they're so screwed.
Well, and I mean, the protests and rallies that happened on the weekend, fantastic. And they happened in different parts of the province, which is amazing. Uh, but we can't let up
No,
because this legislation is going to pass. They've got a majority in the House, unless there are some UCP members who grow a conscience and decide to vote against. Um, and so all Albertans, regardless of how you identify, who think these policies and this legislation is wrong, have got to continue to raise the alarms because as fabulous as what you just described is, think about the emotional toll on a community that is just fighting to be able to live their life in the way that the rest of us. I'm like you. Other than not being male, I have every form of privilege going. Uh, you know? And like I don't have to justify my existence. I don't have to change the way I dress or the way I walk or the way I talk or the way I style my hair, whatever, to pass in society. And, think about just how hard that is to sustain that over time when you're constantly being told that there's something wrong with you. And so all of us have got to join together and stand together and
I
rise.
would make Yeah, I'd make the argument the mental picture. I tend to go to again stories. I love my stories. I tend to go to TV shows that I've really enjoyed and find that little moment that encapsulates what I'm feeling and what I feel like I need to do. And it's a terrible example for the record, but the feeling is right. Um, there's a TV show that was on a little while ago. It was called Dexter. Um,
I remember that show.
Very first episode, Dexter's got one of the bad guys up against the wall, and the bad guy refuses to look at his victims, who are kids. And the moment that I've been living in and committing myself to living in until this legislation is repealed is that moment of anger from Dexter where he just screams at this guy, "Open your eyes and look at what you've done."
Mm.
And I'm going to stay there until this legislation is repealed. So
Well, and what happened to the Daniel Smith that stood up in the legislature 10 years ago crying about, and talking about the LGBTQ2S plus kids that she met? This was around GSAs. I mean, again, craven politics at its absolute worst. It's disgusting.
she's a liar. I mean, again, I've said this many times. She's very good at giving people the impression of authenticity, and she's very good at making people feel like they've been heard. But she will do whatever is necessary for her in any given moment. She's proven that time and time again. And the one consolation that I take in this is that if there is any ounce of humanity that exists in her at some point in time, she is going to have to open her eyes and look at what she's done. And she's going to have to live with that. And I
Mhm.
can't imagine being the the person who has inflicted this much harm on kids and having that moment of clarity or epiphany or whatever and having to live with that. I don't know if she's capable of doing it. I don't know if she's capable of recognizing what she's done. And if she's not, then that just proves my point. She's a monster. But that got dark.
Well, Dexter got us dark, but
No,
but no, I mean, let's hope that day of recognition comes for her because I just it feels so opportunistic, and she's just playing politics. She doesn't realize that she's playing with people's lives.
this is what I'm going to say before I let you go. Because I'm going to try to end as many of the shows that I can with this as long as this debacle continues on. Both Skipping Stone and Egal are going forward with legal challenges. Legal challenges are not cheap. Uh, so anybody who's listening to the show, if you are as equally outraged as I am, or Dr. Peck is, or anybody who has, I don't know, a heart is, then you can absolutely donate to those two organizations, and you should. Um, and that's all I got. Dr. Peck, thank you so much for taking the time to chat for the lengthy time that you have today. Um, and yeah, just keep being awesome.
Thanks very much for having me on. We have a tendency to talk for a long period of time, so
Right?
you might need to break this into two. I don't know to make it digestible for the viewers and listeners, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these important ideas.
No, I appreciate your expertise and your perspective. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.